Creston Valley University sat nestled between rolling hills and old oak trees, the kind of place people called quaint in brochures but underfunded in staff meetings. By day, it buzzed with students rushing to class, professors debating theories in sunlit hallways, and administrators shuffling papers that never seemed to solve anything. But by night, when the chatter faded and the parking lots emptied, another rhythm took over, one of mops swishing across linoleum, trash bags being tied with practiced efficiency, and fluorescent lights clicking on one by one down empty corridors. That's when she arrived. She moved quietly, almost like she didn't want to disturb the silence she'd inherited. Her name was Lila, and for the past 6 years she'd been part of the night crew that kept the math and science wing spotless. Most people didn't notice her. Not really. To them, she was just part of the background, like the hum of the vending machine or the flicker of the hallway light that never quite got fixed. She wore a faded blue uniform, kept her hair in a neat bun, and always carried a thermos of tea that smelled faintly of cinnamon. She never lingered in conversations, never asked for attention, and never complained, even when the AC broke in July or when someone left a full tray of coffee, cups on the floor by accident. But if anyone had bothered to look closer, if they'd glanced at the small notebook tucked in her back pocket, or noticed how her eyes lingered on the chalkboards, still covered in equations long after her shift should have ended, they might have wondered. Because Lila wasn't just cleaning those rooms. She was reading them. Every night as she wiped down desks or emptied recycling bins, she'd pause for just a second in front of the blackboards. Not out of curiosity, but recognition. Those symbols, those integrals and derivatives and infinite series, they weren't scribbles to her. They were sentences, conversations, old friends. Years ago, before life took a sharp turn she hadn't seen coming, Lila had been deep in the world of mathematics herself. She'd studied at a research university, not far from here, and had been on track to earn her PhD. Her focus was on applied analysis, how abstract math could solve real-world problems like airflow over wings or the spread of pollutants in rivers. She'd published a paper before she turned 25. Professors had called her one of the most intuitive minds they'd seen in a decade. Then her mother got sick. It happened fast. 1 month her mom was gardening on weekends. The next she was in hospice. Lila dropped everything, her research, her stipend, her future, to care for her. After her mother passed, the money was gone, the academic momentum lost, and the idea of returning felt impossible. So she took a job cleaning offices. It paid the bills. It kept her steady. And slowly over time she convinced herself that part of her life was over, but math never really left her. On breaks, she'd pull out a worn composition book filled with her own notes, problems she'd dreamed up, solutions she'd refined while folding laundry or waiting for the bus. She subscribed to a few academic journals, read them on her phone during lunch. Sometimes, after her shift ended at midnight, she'd sit in the empty student lounge with her laptop, watching recorded lectures from MIT or Stanford, pausing to scribble ideas in the margins of old receipts. She didn't do it for fame. She didn't even do it for a comeback. She did it because math was how she made sense of the world. It was calm, honest, fair. 2 + 2 was always 4, no matter who you were or what you looked like, and that mattered because out in the real world, fairness wasn't guaranteed. Take Dr. Elena Voss, for example. She taught advanced calculus in room 304, the same room Lila cleaned every Tuesday and Thursday night. Dr. Voss was sharp, stylish, and loud about her progressive views. She wore pins that said equity in STEM, and posted constantly about representation on social media. Students admired her confidence. Colleagues quoted her in meetings. But Lila had noticed something else. It was in the way Dr. Voss spoke to the custodial staff. Not unkindly. Exactly, but with a kind of absent-minded superiority, like she was talking to furniture that happened to breathe. She'd say things like, "Oh, you don't need to worry about that board, it's just calculus," with a chuckle. As if the very idea of someone in a janitor's uniform understanding it was a joke. Lila never reacted. She'd just nod, wipe the board clean, and move on. But inside it stung, not because she needed validation, but because it reminded her how easily people assigned worth based on a uniform, a job title, or the color of someone's skin. One Tuesday, Lila arrived to find room 304 unusually messy. Coffee cups everywhere, crumpled papers on the floor, and the chalkboard absolutely covered in dense multi-layered equations. Some crossed out, others circled with stars. It was clearly from a graduate-level seminar. At the bottom, in bold letters, was a problem labeled Open Challenge, No Known Closed Form Solution. Lila paused. She recognized it. It was a variation of a fluid dynamics problem she'd once wrestled with during her own studies. She stared at it for a long moment, her mop handle resting against her shoulder. The solution wasn't obvious, but it wasn't impossible either. A new substitution method, maybe. Or a clever use of Laplace transforms. She almost smiled. Then she got back to work. She cleaned every surface, stacked the chairs, and carefully erased the board. Except for that one problem. She left it there, untouched, like a quiet signature only she would understand. Later that night, as she walked to her car under a sky full of stars, she thought about that equation, not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet joy. The world might not see her as a mathematician, but that didn't change the truth. She still was one, and sometimes that was enough. A few nights after Lila left that unsolved equation untouched on the board, Dr. Voss stayed late again. She was preparing for a guest lecture from a visiting scholar, and the pressure was getting to her. Her office was a mess of coffee-stained notes and half-empty energy drink cans. She'd been arguing with a colleague over email about whose research was more impactful, and the whole thing left her feeling brittle, like a vase with hairline cracks no one could see but her. When she walked into room 304 to grab her lecture slides, she found Lila mopping near the front row. The chalkboard was mostly clean, but not entirely. Right in the center, that stubborn open problem still lingered, written in faint chalk as if someone had tried to erase it, but changed their mind halfway through. Dr. Voss frowned. "Didn't I ask you to wipe the boards completely?" She said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. More like she was talking to a malfunctioning printer. Lila turned, calm as always. "I did, except that one. Thought maybe someone wanted to keep working on it." Dr. Voss let out a short laugh, light, airy, the kind people use when they think they're being charming. "Oh, honey," she said, glancing at the two undergrads who'd lingered to review notes. "You might want to wipe that off carefully. Wouldn't want you to accidentally solve it by mistake." The students exchanged glances. One snorted. The other looked down quickly, pretending to scribble something in their notebook. It wasn't outright cruelty, just the kind of offhand remark people make when they assume no one important is listening. Lila didn't flinch. She gave a small nod, dipped her rag in the bucket, and wiped the equation away without another word. But something shifted in the room. Not loudly, not visibly. Just a quiet tightening in the air, like the moment before a storm that never quite arrives. Later that week, during a faculty meeting about inclusive pedagogy, Dr. Voss brought it up again. She was describing how even with all our progress, there were still gaps in understanding among support staff. "I mean," she said, leaning back in her chair with a wry smile, "last week I saw our night custodian staring at a Navier-Stokes variant like it was a grocery list. Bless her heart, she's diligent, but let's be real. Some concepts just aren't accessible to everyone." No one challenged her. A few nodded thoughtfully. One professor even chuckled. They didn't know Lila had once derived a simplified stability condition for that exact class of equations during her qualifying exams. They didn't know she could explain Fourier transforms using only a coffee cup and a napkin. And Dr. Voss certainly didn't know that Lila had overheard the tail end of that meeting while quietly replacing a burnt-out bulb in the hallway outside. Lila didn't get angry. Anger took energy, and she'd long since learned to ration hers. Instead, she felt something quieter, disappointment maybe, or the dull ache of being unseen. Again. But that night, something changed. Back in her small apartment, a one-bedroom with second-hand furniture and a bookshelf crammed with math texts disguised as old encyclopedias, Lila opened her laptop. She pulled up the department's public problem archive, found the exact challenge Dr. Voss had posed, and began to work. Not to prove anything. Not for revenge. Just because the problem was beautiful. It described how fluids behave under chaotic pressure, like ocean currents during a storm or blood flow in a narrowed artery. Solving it could help design better heart valves or more efficient wind turbines. That mattered more than ego. She worked until 3 a.m., scribbling on scrap paper, testing substitutions, checking boundary conditions. At one point, she remembered a trick from a paper she'd read years ago. Something about using a dual space transformation to simplify the nonlinearity. It was risky, unconventional, but it worked. By dawn, she had a full solution, clean, elegant, and, most importantly, verifiable. She typed it up in plain lay text, attached a short explanation, and submitted it through the department's anonymous problem portal. She used a campus email tied to facilities, nothing traceable unless someone really dug. Then she made tea, fed her cat, and went to bed like any other night. She didn't expect anything to come of it. But the next morning, the math department was buzzing. Dr. Voss had arrived early and found the solution in her inbox. At first, she assumed it was from one of her grad students showing off. But the approach was unlike anything she'd seen in her class. The notation was precise but refreshingly direct. The logic flowed like water, no unnecessary detours, no performative complexity. Just clarity. She showed it to the department chair, who whistled low under his breath. "This is publishable," he said, "or at least conference-worthy. Who sent it?" Dr. Voss asked, already mentally drafting a praise-filled email to whichever student had finally stepped up. "Anonymous," he replied. But the submission came from a campus IP linked to facilities services. Dr. Voss froze. Facilities, as in custodial? Her first thought wasn't curiosity. It was disbelief. Then embarrassment. Then quickly defensiveness. "No way," she said, forcing a laugh. "Must be a glitch. Or someone forwarding it from another account." But the chair wasn't so sure. He ran a quick trace. The email originated from a terminal in the maintenance break room, the same one Lila used to clock in and out. That afternoon, Dr. Voss spotted Lila restocking paper towels in the men's restroom down the hall. She waited until the coast was clear, then approached. "Hey," she said, arms crossed, voice lower than usual. "Did you happen to send something to the problem inbox?" Lila looked up, wiping her hands on her uniform. "Me? No, why would I do that?" Dr. Voss studied her face. The calm eyes, the steady hands, the lack of nervous blinking. "Because the submission came from your login." Lila didn't panic. She just tilted her head slightly, like someone considering a mildly interesting riddle. "Lots of us use that terminal. Maybe someone else did. But you were the only one on shift that night." A pause. Then Lila said very quietly, "You really think I couldn't do it?" It wasn't a challenge. It was a question, simple, direct. Dr. Voss opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in years, she had no clever comeback. No witty remark to reassert the invisible line she'd drawn between them and us. Before she could respond, Lila added, "Ask me anything. Right now. Any math question you want. If I can't answer it, I'll never touch another chalkboard in this building." The hallway was silent except for the hum of the overhead lights. Dr. Voss hesitated. Part of her wanted to walk away, pretend this never happened. But another part, the part that actually loved math beneath all the posturing, was curious. So she asked a question, not the easiest one, not the hardest, but something only someone who truly understood Hilbert spaces would get right. Lila answered it in under 30 seconds, then explained the intuition behind it using an analogy about tuning a guitar string. Dr. Voss stood there stunned, not because Lila was smart, though she clearly was, but because she'd been so sure she knew who Lila was. And she'd been completely wrong. She didn't apologize. Not yet. But something in her posture changed. The shoulders dropped. The chin lowered. For the first time, she really saw the woman in front of her, not as a role, not as a symbol, but as a person. And that quietly was the beginning of everything shifting. Word traveled slowly in some places and fast in others. At Creston Valley, it moved like a ripple across a still pond. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. It started with the 2 students who'd been in the room that night. They told a friend in the math club. That friend mentioned it to a teaching assistant. Within a week, half the department had heard some version of the story. The night custodian had solved Dr. Voss's unsolvable problem and then calmly answered a graduate-level question on the spot. Most people didn't believe it at first, not because they thought Lila was incapable, but because the idea didn't fit into the boxes they'd built in their heads. Custodians cleaned. Professors taught. Students learned. That was the order of things. When reality bent that order, People reached for explanations that kept their worldview intact. "She must have had help," someone muttered in the break room. "Probably found it online," said another. But the solution was too original for that. Too clean. To hers. Then came the email. The department chair, after double-checking everything with 2 senior faculty members, sent a short message to the math list. "An elegant solution to the open fluid dynamics challenge has been submitted anonymously. After verification, we confirm its validity and originality. The author has been invited to present their approach at next month's colloquium, if they're willing. No name. No photo. Just an invitation." Lila read it on her phone during her lunch break, sitting on a bench behind the science building where no one ever came. She stared at the screen for a long time. Her first instinct was to delete it, to pretend she never saw it. She'd spent years learning how to stay small, how to move through the world without drawing attention. Being seen felt dangerous, like stepping into a room where everyone suddenly turns to look, and you're not sure if they're smiling or judging. But then she thought about the students. The ones who stayed late, frustrated over homework. Eyes tired from staring at textbooks that made math feel like a secret club with a password they couldn't guess. She remembered how lost she'd felt once. Not because she wasn't smart enough, but because no one had shown her that math could be kind. That it could be patient. That it could meet you where you were. Maybe, just maybe, she could be that person for someone else, so she replied. "One sentence, I'll do it. If it's a conversation, not a performance." The chair wrote back within the hour. Done. Meanwhile, Dr. Voss was wrestling with something she hadn't felt in years. Shame. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, gnawing sort that sits in your chest when you realize you've been wrong, in a way that says more about you than the other person. She kept replaying that hallway moment, the way Lila had looked at her, not with anger, but with something worse. Disappointment. Like she'd expected better. She tried to act normal in meetings, but her usual confidence felt hollow. When a colleague joked about janitors moonlighting as geniuses, Dr. Voss didn't laugh. She changed the subject. A few days later, she saw Lila in the supply closet organizing cleaning carts. She almost walked past, then stopped. "Can I ask you something?" Dr. Voss said, voice softer than usual. Lila turned, wiping her hands on a rag. "Sure. Why didn't you say anything before?" "All this time." "You could have been teaching, publishing. You're clearly..." "Clearly what?" Lila asked gently. "Qualified? Smart? Worthy?" Dr. Voss flushed. "I didn't mean it like that." "But you did," Lila said, not unkindly. "And that's okay. Most people don't see past the uniform. I get it, but math doesn't care what you wear. It only cares if you're honest with it." She paused, then added, "I stayed quiet because speaking up never felt safe. Not for someone like me. But that doesn't mean I stopped loving it." Dr. Voss had no reply. She just nodded and walked away. Feeling smaller than she had in years, the ripple kept spreading. A first-year student struggling with differential equations worked up the courage to approach Lila while she was emptying trash in the library. "I heard you. You know math," the student stammered. "I'm stuck on this problem. Could you maybe take a look?" Lila smiled. "Let's see it." They sat on the floor right there, surrounded by recycling bins, and Lila walked her through the concept using a napkin and a pen she pulled from her pocket. She didn't use jargon. She didn't make the student feel dumb. She just asked questions until the light clicked on in the girl's eyes. After that, it became a quiet habit. Students started showing up near the end of Lila's shift, not in crowds, just 1 or 2 at a time, with questions, with curiosity, with hope. She never gave them answers outright. She guided them to find it themselves. "Math isn't about being right," she'd say. "It's about being willing to be wrong until you're not." One evening, a group of 3 undergrads waited outside room 304 with a thermos of tea, cinnamon, just like hers, and a handwritten note. "Thank you for seeing us." Lila cried that night. Not because of the note, but because for the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged, not despite who she was, but because of it. Then came the recording. A student named Theo, who'd been in the room the night of Dr. Voss's comment, asked if he could film Lila's upcoming talk. "Not for clout," he promised. "Just so people who can't be there get to hear it. And maybe, so others like you know they're not alone." Lila hesitated, but she said yes on one condition. No dramatic music, no zoom-ins, no edits that made it feel like a spectacle. Just her, a whiteboard, and the math. Theo agreed. As the colloquium date neared, the department buzzed with nervous energy. Some professors were excited. Others were skeptical. A few worried it would dilute the rigor of the series. But the chair stood firm. This isn't about status, he told them. It's about truth. Lila spent the week preparing, not rehearsing, but thinking. She wanted to talk about more than just the solution. She wanted to talk about how math had been her refuge when the world felt unfair, how it taught her patience, how it rewarded honesty over performance. She didn't know it yet, but that talk would change more than just her life. It would change how an entire campus saw who belonged in the room, and it would force Dr. Voss to finally confront the gap between the ally she claimed to be and the person she'd actually been. But that was still to come for now. Lila stood in front of her mirror the night before the talk, wearing her usual clothes, just clean pressed, and paired with a simple scarf her mother had given her years ago. She took a deep breath. "You've got this," she whispered to herself, not because she needed to prove anything, but because she finally believed she deserved to be heard. Of course. Below is part 5, the final chapter of the story, written in simple, natural English around 1,400 words with no headings, no AI tone, and a deeply human focus. It avoids policy risks, cliched names, and sensationalism, closing the story with warmth, dignity, and quiet transformation. Spring came to Creston Valley with soft rain and blooming dogwoods. The campus felt different. Not because banners hung or policies were shouted from rooftops, but because something subtle had shifted in the way people moved through shared spaces. Doors stayed open longer. Conversations happened in hallways that used to feel too formal. And in the math wing, a small office near the tutoring center now bore a new nameplate: Lila Monroe, STEM mentor and research fellow. She still wore her blue uniform sometimes, not out of obligation, but choice. "It's comfortable," she'd say with a shrug. But more often she wore slacks and sweaters, the kind that said, "I belong here," without needing to prove it. Her official role was part-time, but her presence was everywhere, guiding a nervous freshman through their first proof, helping a transfer student navigate financial aid for summer research, or sitting with a group of high schoolers from a nearby community program who'd never met a black woman who spoke about eigenvalues like they were old friends. She never called it a comeback. To her, it wasn't one. She'd been here all along, just waiting for the world to catch up. The university didn't throw a ceremony when she officially re-enrolled in the doctoral program. No press release, no staged photos, just a quiet email from the registrar and a new student ID that felt strange in her hand at first. But when she walked into her first graduate seminar, this time as a peer, not a cleaner, the professor simply nodded and said, "Glad you're here." No fanfare. Just respect. And that meant more than any spotlight ever could. Dr. Voss didn't vanish after the talk went viral. She didn't resign in shame or suddenly become Lila's best friend. Real change isn't that neat. Instead, she did something quieter and harder. She changed her habits. She started attending Lila's mentorship sessions, not as a guest speaker, but as a listener. She asked questions, took notes. Once she even brought a thermos of cinnamon tea and set it down beside Lila's without a word. It was an apology without saying sorry, and Lila accepted it the same way, by pouring herself a cup and moving on. They never became close. But they learned to share a room without tension, and sometimes that's enough. The video Theo posted never blew up into millions of views. It didn't need to. It found the people it was meant for. Students who'd been told they weren't math people, workers who'd hidden their talents to survive, teachers who realized their classrooms might be missing voices they never thought to invite. Comments still trickled in months later. "You made me believe I could try again. I showed this to my daughter. She wants to be a mathematician now." Lila read them all, not for praise, but to remember why visibility matters, not as performance, but as permission. One afternoon, as she packed up her office after a long day, a young woman knocked on the door. She looked nervous, clutching a notebook to her chest like a shield. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm in the engineering program. I saw your talk, and I just wanted to say thank you. I've been thinking about dropping out." But after hearing you, I decided to stay. Lila smiled and gestured to the chair across from her desk. Tell me what's hard. They talked for nearly an hour, about imposter syndrome, about family expectations, about how exhausting it is to be the only one who looks like you in a lecture hall. Lila didn't offer easy fixes. She just listened. Then she said, "You don't have to be perfect to belong here. You just have to show up and keep showing up, even when it's hard." The student left with straighter shoulders and a borrowed textbook. Later, walking to her car under a sky streaked with pink and gold, Lila thought about how far she'd come, not in titles or recognition, but in peace. She no longer carried the weight of having to prove her worth. That burden had lifted, not because the world declared her worthy, but because she'd finally stopped asking it to. Back home, she opened her old composition notebook, the one with coffee stains and grocery lists in the margins, and turned to a fresh page. She began sketching out a new problem, one she'd been turning over in her mind for weeks. It wasn't for a class. It wasn't for publication. It was just for her. The kind of math that sings when you're alone with it, that rewards curiosity with clarity. She didn't know where it would lead. And for the first time, that was okay. At the university, small changes kept adding up. The facilities staff now had access to professional development funds. The math department redesigned its outreach to include non-traditional learners. And during orientation week, a new tradition began. A hidden voices panel where custodians, cafeteria workers, and administrative staff shared their stories. Talents and dreams, not as tokens, but as full members of the campus community. No one called it Lila's legacy. She wouldn't have liked that. But her presence had opened a door, and others were walking through it, carrying their own gifts, their own quiet brilliance. One evening, as she locked up her office, Dr. Voss passed by with a stack of papers. They exchanged a nod. Then, almost casually, Dr. Voss said, "I've been rereading your solution to that fluid problem. There's something elegant about how you handled the singularity. I'd love to hear more about your thinking if you're open to it." Lila paused. Then she smiled. "Sure, how about coffee tomorrow?" My treat. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't friendship. It was something more honest. Two people choosing to see each other clearly, without the armor of roles or assumptions, and in a world that often rewards noise. That kind of quiet honesty was revolutionary. Lila drove home that night with her window down, the cool spring air brushing her face. Her cat greeted her at the door. Her kettle whistled on the stove. And on her desk the new equation waited, patient, promising, full of possibility. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a symbol. She was just a woman who loved math, who'd been overlooked, and who finally got to stand where she belonged, not because she demanded it, but because she never stopped believing in the truth of her own mind. And sometimes that's enough to change everything. Of course, below is part 4. Written in the same natural, human-centered voice, around 1,400 words, no heading, simple and engaging English with warmth, authenticity, and zero AI tone. It avoids policy risks, cliched names, and keeps the focus on real human moments. The day of the talk arrived with unseasonably warm weather, the kind that made windows fog up and students drag their feet between classes. The math department's usual colloquium room, small, windowless, with folding chairs and a perpetually squeaky whiteboard, was already half full by 4:15 p.m. Not just grad students and professors either. Undergrads sat shoulder to shoulder. A few staff members from facilities lingered near the back, looking proud but unsure if they belonged. Even the dean showed up, slipping in quietly and taking a seat near the door. Lila arrived 10 minutes early, carrying a worn leather satchel and a reusable water bottle. She wore the same blue uniform she always did, but with a dark cardigan over it and that same scarf. Soft, faded, full of memories. She didn't look nervous. Just present, like someone who'd finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. She walked to the front, set her things down, and gave a small wave. No grand entrance. No dramatic pause. Just a quiet hello that somehow filled the room. Then she began. She didn't start with the solution. She started with a story about being a kid who loved patterns, who saw equations in the way rain ran down a window or how leaves spiraled on a stem. She talked about dropping out not with bitterness but with honesty, Life doesn't always give you a straight path. Sometimes you have to walk through the woods to get back to the road. When she finally turned to the math, she didn't rush. She drew a simple diagram, asked the room a question, waited for answers, made people lean forward, not because she was performing, but because she made them feel like they were part of the discovery. At one point, she turned to a first-year student in the third row and said, "You look like you've got a thought." The student, wide-eyed, stammered something half-formed, and Lila built on it like it was gold. "Exactly," she said. "That's the key. No one checked their phone. No one whispered." Even Dr. Voss, sitting in the very back with her arms crossed, found herself nodding along, not because she had to, but because it was good, clear, true. When Lila finished, 40 minutes later, 10 under the usual limit, there was a beat of silence. Then applause. Not polite clapping, but the kind that starts in the chest and spills out because you can't hold it in. Afterward, students swarmed her. Not for autographs, but for conversation. "How did you think of that substitution? Can you explain the boundary condition again? Do you ever get stuck?" She answered every question, never once making anyone feel small. Theo, the student who'd asked to record it, approached with his camera. "You were amazing," he said quietly.
Can I post this?
"With your permission, of course. Just as it is, no edits, no title like Janitor shocks professors. Just your talk." Lila thought about it. Then she said yes. "Call it On Seeing Clearly," she suggested. "Because that's what math taught me. How to see what's really there, not what I expect to see." He uploaded it that night. By morning, it had a few hundred views. By the end of the week, over 50,000, not because it was sensational, but because it was human. Comments poured in. "This made me cry. I felt invisible too." Finally, someone who explains math like it's for everyone. She didn't just solve an equation, she solved a lie we've all been told. Back on campus, things shifted in quieter ways. Students started leaving thank you notes in the custodial supply closet. A professor invited Lila to co-lead a problem-solving workshop. The math club restructured its mentorship program to include non-faculty voices. Dr. Voss watched it all from a distance. She didn't post about it online, didn't try to insert herself into the narrative. Instead, she did something harder. She listened. She sat in on one of Lila's informal sessions, just as a guest, no title, no podium. She brought a notebook, took notes like everyone else. At one point, Lila glanced at her and asked, "Wait, what do you think?" Not as a challenge, but as an invitation. Dr. Voss hesitated, then said, "I think I've been teaching math like it's a mountain only certain people are allowed to climb. But you make it feel like a path anyone can walk." Lila smiled. It always was. That moment didn't fix everything, but it was a start. Meanwhile, the university administration, usually slow to move, began asking questions. Not performative ones, but real ones. Why do we assume expertise only lives in certain roles? How many other Lilas have we overlooked? What would it look like to build a system that sees people fully, not just their job title? They didn't announce a flashy initiative. No press release. But quietly, they created a new position. A part-time STEM mentor role focused on supporting first-gen and underrepresented students. And they offered it to Lila, with full tuition support to finish her doctorate, flexible hours, and a seat at curriculum planning meetings. She accepted, but only if it wasn't framed as a rescue or a comeback. "I'm not returning to math," she told the dean. "I never left. I just didn't have a classroom." The dean nodded. "Then we'll make one." As the semester wound down, something unexpected happened. People started seeing each other. The barista in the campus cafe asked a custodian about his poetry. A biology TA stayed late to help a security guard's kid with algebra. It wasn't perfect. Old habits don't vanish overnight. But the air felt different, lighter, like a room after the windows have been opened. And through it all, Lila kept cleaning. Not because she had to, but because she liked the rhythm of it, the quiet work of making spaces ready for others. Only now, when she walked down the hall, people didn't look through her. They looked at her, and sometimes they even said hello. Dr. Voss still taught her advanced calculus class, but her lectures changed. She asked more questions, listened more, admitted when she didn't know something. And once, during a discussion on assumptions in modeling, she said, "Sometimes the biggest error isn't in the math, It's in who we assume belongs in the room. No one missed the meaning. Lila heard about it later. She didn't gloat. She just made another pot of cinnamon tea and opened her notebook to a fresh page, because the work wasn't done. It never really is. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was moving in the right direction. Not because of one viral moment, but because real change had taken root in ordinary, everyday choices, and that quietly was more powerful than any headline.